We have live captioning available for anyone who needs it. You can access this by pressing the CC button in the meeting controls on your Zoom window. And also please note that our forum tonight is being recorded and will be made available on the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County YouTube channel. You can find that link in the chat. I'll put it up there in a minute. So like I said, good evening, everyone. My name is Lev Elson Schwab, and I serve as the Action and Advocacy Chair for the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County. I am really honored to have been asked to share this land acknowledgement on behalf of the League of Women Voters and our partner organizations who are co-sponsoring this event tonight. We want to acknowledge that our meeting tonight is being hosted on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, whose spiritual connections to these lands forms the foundation of their ways of being. Let us consider how we can make space for their voices to be heard and how we can humbly build relationships with these knowledge keepers. Please join me in a moment of reflection as we consider the full history of Indigenous peoples whose wisdom can teach us much. Thank you. Tonight, we're pleased and proud to have a stellar group of experts on election reform to present to us. Our moderator for the evening is George Chung. George is the director of More Equitable Democracy, and prior to this, he served as the program director for Joyce's Foundation Democracy Program and co-chair of the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. He was also executive director of the Win-Win Network, an affiliate of State Voices, and founder and executive director of Equal Rights Washington, a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. He holds a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's degree in political science from Brown University. George will introduce our panel, and thank you very much. Take it away, George.
Thanks, Lev. Good evening, and welcome everyone to our forum, A Better Democracy, Even Year Elections and Ranked Choice Voting. This forum is sponsored by 7 organizations, all concerned with voting rights and equitable representation. More Equitable Democracy is proud to join the League of Women Voters, Fair Vote Washington, the Northwest Progressive Institute, Sightline Institute, Washington Bus, and the Washington Community Alliance in sponsoring this event. Before we jump into the substance, I just want everyone to really ground themselves in this conversation. When we talk about election reform, it isn't just about building a better mousetrap. It is really about the values implicit in our democracy and our elections. So as you listen to this conversation, I want you to think about what values you hold most dear. Is it equity and minority representation? Is it high voter turnout? Is it more choices? Ease of election administration? There are lots to choose from, and there are trade-offs. So I'm really excited that we have gathered a panel of our region's most respected experts and knowledgeable public officials to discuss democracy reform, and specifically 2 election reform measures that will be on the ballot this November. The first measure we will look at is King County Charter Amendment 1, which, if passed, would move county elections from odd to even years when turnout is significantly higher. Then we will switch to discuss the City of Seattle's Proposition 1B, which would establish ranked choice voting for city elections. The goal of this forum is to increase your understanding of the measures and answer any questions that you may have. In order for us to do so, please enter your questions for the panel in the Q&A function on Zoom. You'll find that at the bottom. If you click on the More button, typically you'll pop up a menu, and so pick Q&A as opposed to the chat function, which I think has been disabled. Please submit those questions throughout the forum. I'll start directing questions to our panelists, and then we'll turn to your questions afterwards. We may not get to all of them because we have limited time, and some may be combined, so please give us your grace. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists, and then we will jump into the discussion. First off is King County Councilmember Claudia Balducci. Councilmember Balducci has been County Council member since 2016. She was elected to chair of the King County Council in 2020. Before that, she served as the mayor of Bellevue and served on the Bellevue City Council. She's a graduate of the Columbia University School of Law, And Councilmember Balducci has always been a strong supporter of voter access and was a prime sponsor for this even year elections charter amendment. Next is Kamau Shege, who is Executive Director of the Washington Community Alliance, a statewide coalition of dozens of organizations of color working to secure a truly multiracial democracy in Washington state. Kamau got his start in organizing through our state's immigrant youth movement, co-founding the Washington Dream Coalition. In 2014, he helped lead the effort to pass the Washington State Dream Act. Kamau is a graduate of Stadium High School and Whitworth University and serves on the board of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, the Win-Win Network, and Balance Our Tax Code. He is also co-chair of the Yes on King County Charter Amendment 1 campaign. So thank you for your leadership, Kamau. Third is Alan Durning, who is Executive Director of the Sightline Institute. He founded the Northwest Environment Watch in 1993, which became Sightline in 2006, and quickly realized that the success of policies that promote sustainability require major democracy reforms that address money in politics and voter access. Researching and advocating for those reforms has been a major focus for Sightline under his leadership. Alan has written or contributed to 9 Sightline books, overachiever, good job. A sought after speaker, he has lectured at the White House, major universities, and conferences on 5 continents. We feel very fortunate to have him join us this evening. Thank you, Alan. We also have Seattle City Council member Andrew Lewis. Prior to serving on the City Council, Councilmember Lewis worked as an assistant city attorney in the Seattle City Attorney's Office. He earned a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley. We thank Councilmember Lewis for his support of ranked choice voting and introducing the ordinance that gives us the opportunity to vote for it. And finally, we have Lisa Aero, Executive Director of Fair Vote Washington. Lisa first learned about ranked choice voting many years ago when she taught a lesson to her middle school students about mathematics of voting and elections. Since that time, she has worked tirelessly to promote this democracy reform. Her efforts have supported not only Seattle's ballot question, but similar questions in Clark and San Juan counties, as well as promoting the option of RCV in the legislature. Thank you, Lisa, for your leadership. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's start from the top and start with even year elections. So my first question is for Councilmember Balducci. Councilmember, can you please describe the even year elections charter amendment and why you introduced it? And generally speaking, why do you think it's a good idea?
Absolutely. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Thank you. Had a little bit of technical problems. I think I've got them under control. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for putting together this forum and for everything you do to support elections. I was interested in County Charter Amendment 1 because I've always tried to do something in almost each year of my service at King County to improve access to voting. I just believe very strongly, as I know you all do here tonight, that government is best when the elected officials are most reflective of the communities that they serve and are selected by as many of the people that we serve as possible so that we are their voice and that we are accountable to them. In my past work, I've mainly focused on access and education. So funding more ballot boxes, postage paid ballots at King County. We were the leader in the state doing that, et cetera. And so we really focus on those kinds of nuts and bolts, making it easier for all people to vote stuff. And so when a group called Northwest Progressive Institute came to me with this proposal for even year elections at King County, I took it under consideration, but it wasn't something that was really high up on my list. And then when I looked closer at it, it was almost hard to believe how something this simple could make such a difference. And let me explain what the charter amendment would do. Currently, the elected officials of King County, with the exception of the prosecutor, are elected in odd numbered years. Each of the 9 county council members, and then the county executive, county assessor, and the county elections director, those 12 elected positions are all elected in odd numbered years. And but most counties in the state conduct these kinds of elections in even numbered years. They do that because their government form is set up by state law. They're called statutory counties. King County has a charter, which is kind of choose your own adventure form of government. And we, for whatever reason, have always held our elections in even number years. We're one of only 3 counties in the state that does this. And the difference that that makes is we get between 20 and almost 50% fewer voters, registered voters, voting in our elections in odd numbered years than comparable races in even numbered years. We could almost double in a very big year like 2020, we would almost double the number of people who are voting for these important positions in King County if we were holding the vote in an even numbered year. For example, this year, our county prosecutor, because it's handled differently, is up for election this year, and it will see very, very high turnout. If you look at past elections for county prosecutor, they get relatively high turnout, and much higher than we saw in the county executive race last year, which was a hotly contested race with a lot of public interest, and fewer people voted in that race by far than in the county prosecutor's race. So I talked to our elections staff in terms of cost, in terms of implementation, any other challenges. We heard basically no negatives, and we could have an electorate that is far larger, but not just larger, also far more reflective of the people of King County. The demographics of people who vote in even numbered years include more young people, more people of color, and more renters versus homeowners, which we see in our odd numbered year elections. So generally speaking, just with this one very modest change, there's no opposition, no formal opposition to it, we could make a really big difference. I will say that there have been there were 2 council members who voted against putting this on the ballot, and their arguments were essentially, maybe voters won't get enough information because there are going to be too many different things on the ballot in even numbered years, and that this would be bad for Republicans, that it would have a partisan lean. And I would say in response to those objections that I believe, and I think the statistics bear out, that most voters get their information just in time when they're ready to vote. They look to whatever sources they look to, whether it be newspaper endorsements, friends, the voter's guide. I think we have some polling that shows that most people actually use those voter's guides to make their decisions, and they will do so again. And also this happens in most counties. In Pierce County, we see higher turnout for their even numbered year elections than here. And I'm sure that those voters are just as educated as King County voters are. And secondly, I don't think that you do not see a partisan lean happening in other counties that use even year elections. So it seems to me to be fair, easy, inexpensive. I don't know why we wouldn't do this. And then finally, I'll just say that the positions that we're voting for here are maybe under the radar, not the things you think about every day. You think about your county council member or your county assessor. These are very important functions that have decision-making power that affects important things that government services that we all use: buses, public safety, policy around public safety, equity and land use and all kinds of things, sort of the nuts and bolts of community life. And so I really want to urge everyone here tonight to please support and vote for our Charter Amendment number 1 for even year elections in King County. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember, for your leadership. And perhaps this will start a wave for the other 2 counties that still have odd year elections to reconsider their structures. So thank you again for your leadership. I want to turn to Kamal Shege from the Washington Community Alliance and just get your sense that, if passed, what impact do you see even year elections having on traditionally underrepresented communities, particularly communities of color, and ultimately on the kind of policy decisions or outcomes that may change depending on higher voter turnout? Kamal?
Yes, those are really good questions. I just want to make sure, can everybody hear me?
All good, yes.
Perfect. one thing that is going to be really clear as a change that's going to affect the people who are part of the League of Women Voters in Seattle and King County is you're organizing if we win and when we win and this gets implemented is going to get a whole lot easier. I'm sure everybody here has had the same experience that I know I've had a lot of times where you're trying to get your neighbors or people at the park or wherever you're organizing to vote. And you go up to them and you say, hey, my name is Kamau. I'm with the League of Women Voters. Your voice is so important to our election. Every vote counts. And I'm here to let you know that there's an election coming up. And I'd love for you to make a plan to vote. And on odd years, we usually get the same universal response from most people, which is, what are you talking about? I just voted last year. And this is really important insight at the grassroots level for people who are trying to make our democracy more vibrant and bring more everyday working class people into the process is we have the lived experience of talking to folks and recognizing that for them, they experience elections based on the amount of attention there is. And it just so happens to be that we live in an era of very low media density. We live in an era of some of the lowest social trust. So people are having less and less friends. Some of the big connecting institutions that used to connect people aren't as present. And so in these odd years, most people don't think that there are important elections. But the people on this call, we understand that these county elections are critical to the services that many might take for granted. And so that's one big impact. I also just want to put some numbers to what Councilmember Balducci talked about here, specifically when it comes to voters who turn out at lower rates for the specific reason that they don't really know that an election is happening or that an important election is happening. If you look at 2019 among young voters, in the primary, there was just 7.9% turnout. And in the general, there was just a little over 15% turnout in 2019. And this is at a time where, politics is kind of a big deal. We're not talking about the 90s or the early aughts. There's really important issues there. And the very next year, on an even year where you have the president running, for young voters, those numbers were 36% in the primary and over 60% in the general election. And you see this trend where across voters of color, for Asian voters, moving our county elections to even years would more than double their turnout in the primary from 15 to over 40%, in the general from about 25% to over 70%. And for Latino and Black turnout, it's even higher, more than tripling the turnout in those communities. And that's not also to say, as Councilmember Balducci put so well, that people are going to pay less attention to county elections. If anything, they're going to be paying attention more to those elections because there's going to be more news reports. There's going to be more dialogue among the people they trust in their church or their synagogue or their mosque about, hey, I got a flyer for this county election, or what do you think about this county executive race? And that kind of cacophony of conversation around the elections is what creates this increased turnout in even years. And so there aren't a whole lot of opportunities that we as people in the civic engagement space have for increasing turnout. We're usually in there, fighting for every inch by organizing more people, registering more people. But when we can institutionalize our changes through charter amendments like this one, we can have a massive effect and bring so many more people into our democracy at a time when our democracy needs it the most. So that's what makes me excited. And that's some of the material impacts from this change that people can see, we can expect to see.
Thanks, Kamau. In reading the Seattle Times tepid endorsement for King County Charter Amendment 1, they basically said, okay, fine, better turnout in King County, that's good, but maybe we should just stop there because maybe at the city level, we need more attention to those issues. Kamau, you as an advocate, what do you think about just like drawing the line at county and then, leaving like cities and school boards on odd years?
Yeah, I think this is a place where the Seattle Times editorial board, even in all their wisdom, is a little bit mistaken on the actual data. So we know that people might not have the information about every single race. And many of us on this call are going to get our ballots, and we're going to find some people running for, county clerk, people running for municipal judge. And we are like the insiders of the insiders, the people who think about the stuff all the time. And what happens when we run into a race where we don't have that information is we look for cues from the institutions we trust. So, what's their party affiliation? Some of you might search up their PDC contributions, but many of you, as Councilmember Balducci said, and the data shows, over 80% of people make their decisions based on this handy guide that's nonpartisan that our state provides. And that's often enough information for voters to make a choice. And then they can look at other endorsements from people. And the same thing is true if you moved cities and school boards and other levels of offices to the down ballot. People are going to show up to vote because of the high stakes at the top of the ballot, but you don't see a drop off that's very significant as people move down to these more obscure offices. We don't have dog catchers, but that's kind of like the running joke among our circles. It's like people are also going to vote for dog catcher based on some of the cues they pick up. The other thing that's really important for all of us who are organizing our communities to know is over the last 2 decades or so, we've gotten tons of data about what gets a infrequent voter to become a frequent voter. And Analyst Institute, which gathers up this data, shows that those infrequent voters need 7 touches. Now that's really difficult in odd years because you only have a handful of offices that are being contested. Councilmember Balducci knows this and other elected officials. Lots of people have been in there for a long time. Those offices go uncontested. And so people don't get as much mail. They don't get as many phone calls, and they definitely don't get as many door knocks. But when you have elections happening on even years, what happens is you have someone running for a statewide office, and they're going to campaign to all the people across the state. And you have someone running for Congress or US Senate, and they're going to send their materials about how important it is for them to vote in that race and on down the ballot. And pretty soon you get, again, this cacophony of signals being sent to infrequent voters who, for good reasons are more concerned with their everyday lives, learning that, hey, there's an important election coming up. And I've gotten so much information about it, I'm almost sick of it. And I'm going to turn in my ballot, and it gives us as organizers the really great talking point, right? Where, hey, if you don't want any more contacts from campaigns, vote early and you'll be taken off that list. And so, the Seattle Times is really mistaken. I think they're more concerned about ad revenue in odd years for their paper than they are about the vibrancy of our democracy and how many people will turn out. So I hope we don't stop here and we continue pushing for things like the bill in the state legislature that would allow us to move city elections to even years.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing more from the Washington Community Alliance and other allies who see this as the tip of the iceberg. One more question for Councilmember Balducci, just in terms of the change of timing for the change of timing. Can you say a little bit about the implementation? Like, will we still have King County Council elections next year? Or
yes. Yeah, great question. It is a slow roll to implement. So the way the charter would be implemented is next year, as scheduled, half of the district, half of the county council offices and a couple of the countywide would be up as usual. But we will run for 3-year terms, so that at the end of that term, we will run again in 2028 instead of 2029. And then 2 years later, in 2027, the rest of the county council and the county executive will be up again for 3-year terms. So we'll do that twice. In 2 years, next year, 3-year terms, the following cycle, 3-year terms. And at the end, in 2030, we will be fully on even year elections. So there's nothing abrupt about this. We are taking our time. We are doing it gradually.
All right. So the campaign chant for the next couple rounds will be 3 more years.
3 more years, 3 more years, or even better, 3 years.
3 years.
You're an
Fair.
exciting candidate.
Thank you. Well taken. All right, let's move on. We're gonna move on to Alan at Sightline. So Alan, I know that Sightline was an early supporter of both even year elections as well as ranked choice voting 1B and ranked choice voting writ large. Can you share your perspectives about why an organization that cares about sustainability, like what does democracy have to and ranked choice voting and even year elections have to do with it?
Oh, George, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the question. And thanks to the other panelists and to League of Women Voters for organizing this event this evening. Throughout my childhood, my mom and my grandmother were active members of the Seattle League. And so I associate the League of Women Voters with fun babysitters who would come and care for me when my mom or my grandmom was out. So thank you for that. I got to stay up later and watch more TV than normal. George, let me come around to that question with I direct a think tank, which means that I like to kind of go big a little bit and put this in a frame. I was thinking earlier today, the degree to which democracy in this country, even this world, has always been a promise only imperfectly realized. And here in the Northwest, at our best, we have been leaders toward fuller realization of that promise. It's always little steps at a time, It was more than 200 years ago that the first American multiracial, all-gender election happened, according to some historians anyway, and it happened here in the Northwest in 1805, when the Lewis and Clark expedition was on the coast, and York, an enslaved Black man, and Sacagawea, an indigenous woman, were welcomed to cast votes as equals with other members of the party. We've been striving ever since to manifest that same kind of inclusiveness. And I would argue it's continuing. 2 centuries of struggle for unpropertied men and for women, for people of color, for indigenous nations, for immigrants, for the formerly incarcerated. We've come a long way. We're not all the way there, but we've come a long way. We're doing the same thing, not just on voting rights, but on electoral systems. In Washington, we were an early adopter of nonpartisan primary elections, which are a huge improvement over the closed primary elections that most places use. Some other states have followed us, including California, and now Alaska has improved on our top 2 election system with top 4 open primaries and then ranked choice general elections. Washington was an early adopter of automatic voter registration, following Oregon, and then came Alaska and a bunch of other states. In King County, partly through Councilmember Balducci's leadership, we've been a leader on many other things. First King County, and then Washington State were leaders on vote by mail. King County was early in allowing permanent absentee registration, so that up to half of the electorate was already permanently registered for absentee ballots before we even moved to full vote by mail. And King County, as the council member mentioned, was early in adopting paid postage for mail-in ballots, and in fact then pushed the state to adopt paid postage for mail-in ballots. Little by little, we have been improving our democracy, moving towards the dream of a more fully realized promise. In Seattle in 2015, we led again with democracy vouchers, which have spurred people-powered campaigns with far more participating donors than anywhere else in the country by a large measure. and with more diverse candidates, including Councilmember Lewis, who has joined us and ran in the democracy voucher system. And now the way I see it is we have 2 more opportunities to take real steps forward to upgrade our democracy, to get a little closer to realizing the promise. We've just been hearing about even year elections, and I'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about ranked choice voting. The thing that's so amazing to me, and I'll just comment a little bit as Kamau and Claudia did, was it's such a simple and powerful tool. It's like the hidden bombshell that's on the November election. There is no other reform known to humanity that increases voter turnout as much as does moving elections to the even year. Our numbers suggest about a 60% increase in participation in King County if we move to the even year, and that seems like such a big win that we can't pass it up. It is also likely to improve representation for younger voters, voters of color, lower income voters, renters, as the council member mentioned. And there's a bunch of empirical research now, as Kamau was alluding to, about what can we do to improve participation, improve representation, and improve policymaking. And in all of these tests, even year elections pass very clearly. There's also one of Sightline's biggest concern is the lack of affordable housing in our community. This is a central concern for sustainability in our region. We're trying to build green, walkable, transit-oriented cities, but they're becoming so outrageously expensive that no one can afford to live there. And it turns out that there's a robust body of literature that suggests that moving elections to even years dramatically improve the number of housing units that get built. So that's one reason, George, why an organization whose mission is fundamentally about sustainability would be concerned about this measure that would move elections to when the voters are. So this is a chance for King County to catch up. And King County has been a leader in so many ways, but we trail, as the council member said, 36 of the 39 counties in the state. We also trail all of Oregon, where all counties vote in even years, and where all cities vote in even years as well, along with cities are moving right and left across the country. More than 60 cities in California, almost every city in Arizona and Nevada have switched, smattering of other cities around the country in Florida, New Jersey, all across the country. Cities are figuring out that this is an important move to make. And so Washington can do that next. But first, we can make that happen in King County, which is the largest county in the state. In fact, the largest county by population anywhere in the Northwest. It's got a state budget, as the council member was pointing out. It's a big government. You know, the budget of King County is similar to that of the state of Alaska or the state of Montana. This is a giant institution and ought to be governed by a body that's more representative than what we've had to date. So I did an analysis about this. We'll put it in chat about why we should move to even year elections. So that's the next big step that I see us making in the Seattle and King County area. And the second is this step to begin the transition to ranked choice voting. So as I already mentioned, we already use nonpartisan open primaries in top 2 general elections, and that's an improvement over what's used in most places where they have closed party primaries and then plurality elections, sometimes called first past the post. Those are the norm in the United States, and Washington is already better. But our system here is still imperfect. Top 2 primaries are typically low turnout affairs, and when there are large fields of candidates, as there increasingly are, thanks to democracy vouchers and so on, top 2 elections sometimes screen out too many candidates. So you have a small group of people choosing from a big field of candidates, just 2 people who will go on to the general election when the larger electorate shows up. And sometimes we end up without a finalist who general elections particularly like. That's how Washington, a deep blue state, ended up with a Republican state treasurer a few years ago, because 3 Democrats split the vote, allowing 2 Republicans into the top 2 slots in the top 2 general. That's how the city attorney's race last year, or the mayor's race, arguably last year, went from very large pools to somewhat unusual combinations of finalists. You can look back over the city's history at some other peculiar, unexpected outcomes, or look at Washington's 3rd congressional district this year, where a top 2 primary knocked out a moderate incumbent, leaving candidates who are arguably too liberal and too conservative for the district. So we do have a chance to improve on our top 2 system. We have a chance to improve it by changing the electoral system, or replacing this top two primary with one of two alternative systems that are on the ballot. Approval voting is on the ballot, and so is ranked choice voting. The choice is that this vote is a complicated ballot measure for voters. Sightline has done extensive analysis of approval voting, and we think it's actually kind of interesting, but it's risky and untested, not ready for prime time in Seattle, not ready to be the system by which Seattle elects its top leaders. You can read, I think, something like 6,000 words of Sightline analysis with charts and graphs and a lot of citations. We'll put the articles in chat. Ranked choice voting seems like a much safer choice, though. We know it's been very widely used around the country. 50 jurisdictions, hundreds and hundreds of elections have been conducted this way. Tens of millions of ballots have been cast using ranked choice voting. And we know what it does. We know that it gives people the opportunity to express more of their choices, more of their preferences. And in the context of Seattle, it will reduce the frequency with which we end up with unusual outcomes as the top two finalists. I know that we're going to hear from others about the details of it. I'll just mention that in Seattle, by moving forward on ranked choice voting, we're joining a little bit of a local wave. We have in Seattle, the proposal is to replace primaries with ranked choice voting, but there are also measures in Portland and in Multnomah County, Oregon, and in Clark and San Juan counties, Washington, that are also on the ballot next month, and they will be using slightly different forms of ranked choice voting. So ultimately, I see the movement in Seattle to doing primaries, the primary version of ranked choice voting, that is what we can vote on right now, as a step towards ultimately even more sweeping change, what I would love to talk about in questions, but having run on enough, I will just remind you that we have been striving forward now for more than 2 centuries, since Sacagawea and York voted at the mouth of the Columbia, towards a democracy that better realizes the promise. Even your elections and ranked choice voting are the next step opportunities for us to realize that chance. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for helping us make that connection to why Sightline and other organizations that don't primarily work on democracy reform ought to care. I just want to remind everyone that we are open to your questions, so please use the Q&A function. You'll need to tap the More button, and in the little pop-up menu, pick Q&A and drop your questions for the panelists. We're now going to switch to Councilmember Lewis. We're going to go from big picture policy ideas to really the specific proposal that for us voters in the city of Seattle that we will be considering. So Councilmember Lewis, welcome. My main question for you today is, why did you choose to sponsor this bill to put ranked choice voting on the ballot in November?
Well, thank you, George, and thank you to the League of Women Voters and everybody else who's brought us here tonight. It's good to be able to join and talk about these really critical democracy reforms that are going to be on the ballot for Seattle and King County voters just next month. It's coming to a head. So back in the summer, we were given a decision point that was forced by the approval voting advocates successfully organizing, getting the signatures to put approval voting on the ballot. That gives the Seattle City Council an opportunity to put a alternative proposal to be posed to voters that is responsive to the same issue the underlying ballot measure is trying to fix. In this case, approval voting, which is trying to create a more responsive and equitable electoral result. And personally, I thought that the voters of Seattle, if we were going to decide on changing the way that we conduct our elections, should be given the choice of what really the emerging best practice in this field is, which is ranked choice voting. A number of major metropolitan cities in the United States have adopted ranked choice voting for municipal elections. San Francisco, in many ways a peer city to the city of Seattle, uses ranked choice voting, as does New York. 2 American states, Maine and Alaska, use ranked choice voting. In August, we saw ranked choice voting in Alaska lead to a pretty dramatic result, fairly representative, I think, of the incentives of ranked choice voting when Congresswoman Patola defeated Sarah Palin, the very polarizing former Republican governor of Alaska. So, talking now more broadly about the proposal itself, just to give a brief overview, and the Sightline executive director who spoke before me gave an initial overview of the proposal, which would having ranked choice voting in the primary to determine the top 2 candidates who would go on to a general election in a traditional one-on-one matchup. The way that the system would work, it wouldn't go into effect until 2027 per the timeline that was proffered to us by King County Elections. That process would allow voters to rank up to 5 choices in a ranked choice ballot, and then those top 2 people through that process who receive the highest proportion of the vote would go on to the general election. So fairly simple for voters to understand. As we've seen in other jurisdictions, voters take to ranked choice voting pretty quickly. There's very high rates of reported voter satisfaction when ranked choice voting is introduced. And I think that we can see from the standpoint both from the voters, the consumers of democracy, and then for us politicians, the products that people are parsing from, how it would be a more accurate portrayal of people's preferences. Because all democracy is a process. Like when you get on the Seattle City Council, if you're a legislator, right, like everything is done in multiple iterations, working with your colleagues, and you don't really face quite as many zero-sum choices like putting your vote all in on one person. And ranked choice voting allows for a more comprehensive process where voters have a reason to go and get together and meet with candidates, even if they know who their first choice is, because if they have to rank 5 other choices, especially in a crowded field, I was elected for city council in a field with 11 candidates. If someone could rank up to 5 in a field of 11, they'd want to spend a little bit more time really getting to know who that field is in terms of who they're ranking them. And in a field of 11 people, a second or third place preference can be really important. And it provides incentives for candidates to also be nicer to each other and nicer to the general public, because being nice, being responsive is rewarded in that system. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to you, George, having given that overview, and happy to answer additional questions.
Thank you, Council Member. One question that I have for you right off the bat is, you mentioned that ranked choice voting is one of the kind of emerging best practices, but my understanding is that it's best if it's implemented without a primary, that you just have everyone run in the general election and then it's high voter turnout, you get lots of choices. So it seems odd that the approval voting people first put up this issue of just changing how the primary is done with approval voting, and then you had to respond in terms of ranked choice voting. Like, why keep the primary as opposed to getting rid of the primary and having either approval or ranked choice in the general election?
Well, Washington state law currently preempts us from making that change. Otherwise, I'm sure my colleagues and I would have, by majority vote, put sort of a true instant runoff voting model on the ballot that would be more in line with what the voters of Maine in particular currently use, to my understanding. We're not currently allowed to. My hope is that we'll be able to get permission from the state to adopt a system like that in Seattle. And as was indicated earlier, given that we have a timeline till 2027 to implement this, if we get some responsive state action, we might be able to do the tweak before this goes live. It's the same software, it's the same equipment. It wouldn't really lead to a fundamental change, I don't think, in the timeline of King County elections, because it's the same fundamental idea. We're just kind of tweaking, one election instead of 2. So that's the reason. If we weren't preempted, we totally would have given a true IRV system. But I think a lot of those process improvement considerations are still relevant to the to even the system that has a primary and then a general election in terms of the improvement to democracy, improvement in voter choice, and improvement in voter enthusiasm for the process.
Thank you, Councilmember. I just want to underscore that this really is state law that requires the top two primary, which preempts cities like Seattle who may want to get rid of the primary. So my organization and Kamau's organization and Sightline have been leading the charge with support from League of Women Voters to pass a local options bill that would give more flexibility to cities like Seattle that want to go above and beyond what is very limiting by state law. So we look forward to seeing you in Olympia, Councilmember Lewis, to help us get that local options bill passed. Thank you.
Happy to support it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to Lisa Aero. Lisa, I would love you to answer two questions, from your middle school math perspective. Can you please, without too much value judgment at the beginning, describe how ranked choice voting would work and separately how approval voting would work? And then I'll give you a little bit of a softball in terms of why you think one is better than the other.
Thank you, George. And thanks again to our league sponsors tonight. I'm a league member, and it is just such a proud feeling to be so well supported by the league here on this Seattle ballot measure. And obviously huge thanks to Andrew, Councilmember Lewis, for making this ballot measure something that Seattle voters are going to get to weigh in on now in just a little over 2 weeks. So what is ranked choice voting? It's so simple. On your ballot, you'll still pick your first choice just like usual. But instead of being limited to just that one choice, you have the option to go on and rank your backup choices. First choice, second choice, third choice, and so on, as many as you like. And what that means for you as a voter is that if your first choice can't win, your vote isn't wasted. It goes on, it counts still for your next choice. As Alan Durning and Councilmember Lewis have said, gives voters more say, gives voters more reason to be involved and to be voting, to be engaged in the civic process. Second part of your question, George, I think you wanted me to describe. I hope that was non-judgmental enough. Just how it works.
That was good.
How it works. So approval voting is
yes.
a simple thumbs up, thumbs down on every candidate. Every voter has actually I think an aha moment for people when they're understanding what approval voting is. It actually does give voters more than one vote. Voters can have different numbers of votes because as a voter, you can literally vote yes on multiple candidates and all of those votes will be counted. Contrast that with ranked choice voting, which sticks to the one vote. Each voter has one vote. It's just a backup. Approval voting, you have as many votes as you like. A challenge with approval voting comes with the strategy. How many, where do you draw the line in terms of, as a voter, if I like somebody just a teeny bit, am I still going to include them in the list of candidates I approve of? And then there's a good deal of strategy around that. But I know you didn't ask me that question, so I'll stop there.
And so thank you for laying that out for us. So why are you supporting ranked choice voting as opposed to approval voting? Both seem simple and useful.
So drawing a contrast here. And again, I just want to say that Alan Durning and Councilmember Lewis have gone through a lot of the territory. I could talk about why it is that advocates in Washington State for more than 5 years have been building this grassroots energy for ranked choice voting, why it was that Councilmember Lewis, when he and his colleagues were faced with a decision about whether to send the approval voting measure to the ballot with or without a council proposed alternative, they were able to relatively quickly and easily recognize that they already have a grassroots movement, broad and deep in the community for ranked choice voting. So that meant it made sense to move forward with that. So ranked choice voting, again, tested, proven. That's one of the main differences that Alan Durning described between the two measures on your ballot if you're a Seattle voter. One is very much approval voting untested, only been used in 2 cities just in the last couple of years, St. Louis and Fargo, North Dakota, whereas ranked choice voting has a track record of more than 100 years of use around the country, or excuse me, around the planet. More than 500 elections here in the US alone in the last couple of decades. So we know when we talk about the benefits of ranked choice voting, which you've heard, better representation, tamping down negative campaigning, encouraging more women and people of color, more first-time candidates to run and win. All of these benefits are proven. So point number 1, ranked choice voting tested and proven. I would say point number 2, in contrasting the two, I would lift up the track record of representation that ranked choice voting really has. It really is, again, electing more governments that better reflect the community, as Councilmember Balducci said right at the get-go. A great example, last summer, New York City used ranked choice voting for the first time. Its city council, which had had 14 out of the 51 members were women prior to that ranked choice election, 14 out of 51. And it changed in that one election. Now 31 women out of 51. It's a majority women council now, which represents much better the city. And 26 of those are women of color. So we saw ranked choice voting working to bring better representation. So that's a second distinction between the two methods. So tested and proven, track record on representation. Certainly the robust state and local support for ranked choice voting is evident in the more than, I think 30 endorsers at this point. I know that there's a link to the campaign website. Folks can check it out after the forum. You can go and enjoy the website, and all of the endorsers to date are listed. If you take a look at the approval voting website, I believe the total number of endorsers is still at 0. That's my understanding. So you don't see the local support there at all. We also see voters engaging with the system with ranked choice voting. In places that ranked choice voting is being used, voters are using their rankings. More than 71% of voters in all of those elections that I named, the 500 plus, more than 71% of voters actually use those rankings. And the concern that we're seeing with approval voting in the very limited numbers of elections that's been used is voters are actually not using the option of approving of more than one candidate. So it really reverts back to the same system we're using now without having made a change. And the reasons for that have to do with the high levels of strategy that are involved in voting on an approval ballot. So I'd say those are some of the main distinctions.
I want to just underscore that we are open to your questions. So I see a number of them have been coming through. So I encourage everyone, as we still have about 25 minutes or so, or 30 minutes, please keep sending your questions. I will field as many of them as I can. I'm actually going to go back to Lisa and ask a question about maybe some hand wringing that's happening in Alaska, that some people are unhappy with the results. And I feel like there's an odd echo with a few times where ranked choice voting actually was implemented here 10 years ago for a short period of time. Can you say a little bit about those dynamics and what your organization is doing in ensuring that there's enough engagement and public education around the potential implementation of ranked choice voting?
Sure. I think you may be referring to Pierce County's brief use of ranked choice voting almost 20 years ago, very briefly, in the early days of ranked choice voting being used in this country. And Pierce County did a noble experiment. They had to pull together all the hardware and software. It was very early days, so the logistical challenges were pretty steep. They ran a relatively expensive election, because anytime you're doing something for the first time, it's relatively expensive. And then the voters had a chance to move and join the rest of the state in adopting the brand new top 2 model, which was brand new then. And so they stepped away from ranked choice and joined the and they now use top two. So it was a brief experiment, and there is no indication that anything was difficult or problematic, other than that it was early days. And the great news for Washington State and Seattle is that now there have been 2 decades of use of ranked choice voting in all these 50 plus cities and 2 whole states that Councilmember Lewis referenced. It's going well. Voters like it. More than 85% of voters in Alaska said it was simple to use. 95% of New York City voters said it's simple and they want to keep on using it. So there's every indication that Seattle can benefit from all of the best practices that have now been established in these last 20 years for implementation. And voter education is another thing that in the last 20 years, jurisdictions have learned a lot about how to smoothly roll out ranked choice elections. So it's happening for lower costs and with, again, very smooth rollouts we're seeing. So we're excited to work with King County Elections to implement ranked choice voting for Seattle.
And I'm on mute. Great, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to send this next question back to Councilmember Lewis. One critique that I've heard is that implementation will be really expensive, and shouldn't the city be spending its money on other things like affordable housing? Can you respond to that critique? And is it true? Will it cost a lot of money to implement ranked choice voting in King County?
Yeah, well, I mean, like a lot of these election reforms do end up coming along with costs, right? I mean, we had the democracy voucher program transition that ended up coming with some costs attached to it, but I would say it dramatically improved the quality and the accessibility of our local democracy. So, look, it's in the scheme of what the cost is going to be. A lot of it is going to be one time. It's the acquisition of, for King County elections, of the new equipment, of the personnel that are necessary to run a ranked choice voting election. Once that is done, the existing bureaucracy institution of King County elections is going to be able to administer these elections in course, just like they have under the previous first past the post system. And that's something that the voters can weigh, but it's not something that's going to carry, a consistent, ongoing cost impact. One thing that Seattle voters will be very used to is it is true that ranked choice voting jurisdictions tend to take longer to do the count. It can be a more sophisticated count. Now, we're very used to waiting forever to get our entire result. That's just something that's kind of part of our culture. We've always had a very large vote by mail result, for example, and if a race is very close, it can take till the end of a week. It can take 2 weeks before you know the outcome of a close election. So I think that is something that that will continue to be part of what we expect under ranked choice voting. But after those initial capital costs to acquire equipment and make that shift, I think on the whole, something as fundamental as our democracy, the experience with it is going to be enhanced by transitioning to this system, and it's worth that investment.
George,
So,
may I add one point
please,
here?
go ahead.
Just for King County, because this is a place where I've been in the weeds. King County actually doesn't need any new hardware. It is a software upgrade that would be required. And I agree with everything else Councilmember Lewis said on that. And in terms of timeline, excuse me, in terms of timeline, we have seen jurisdictions implement ranked choice voting generally much more quickly and at much lower costs than the original estimates tend to be. And of course, it's the job of the election administrators to make sure that they're going to have plenty of time and plenty of resources, and to say, oh, it's going to cost this much and it's going to take this long. And what we're typically seeing is jurisdictions end up implementing it much quicker and at a small fraction of the originally estimated cost.
Thank you. And a strong democracy is not free. So this is something that we ought to value. Next question I'll throw over to Alan Durning. Given that we have limits in terms of we must have a top two, so therefore if we implement, let's say, ranked choice voting as is preferred by the folks here, what impact do you think it will have on elections, given that we still will have a top two? Like, do you see different people getting through the primary in the top two using ranked choice voting as opposed to the current first and second past the post?
That's a great question, George. So there will, when there's a large pool, there will sometimes probably be a different winner than there would have been in a regular plurality count. It's really hard to say because different people run and they run different kinds of campaigns in ranked choice voting. When you're running in a ranked choice race, you want to appeal not only to your base, but also to other candidates' bases. So you run less negative and you look for commonality. If you want to see a quintessential ranked choice campaign, look at the campaign that Mary Peltola in Alaska has just run. She has reached out day after day after day to the people who are supporting her opponents and pointed to areas where she agrees with them and was honest about her differences as well. You'll probably have different winners, but it will be as often as not because people ran different campaigns and different people ran as the counting method itself. But occasionally you'll have a case where there are 5 candidates and nobody got very many. It's the vote is split pretty widely, and then once you start eliminating the person with the least votes and shifting their second place votes, that you'll have someone else nudge ahead into the general. Like Councilmember Lewis, I hope that we can get a statewide reform so that relatively soon we can move from using the ranked choice only in the primary to moving it to using it in the general, either in the form that San Juan and Clark County are using, where you have single winner races, or in the form that Portland is using, where we have multi-winner races and we move to actual proportional representation. We're not quite there yet, but I'd love to talk about that as well.
Maybe that proportional representation is something for the next time we chat, because I would love to talk more about that too. But you alluded to some of your other criticisms of approval voting. Someone asked, would love to just hear a little bit more from you in terms of beyond being untested. I know that Lisa shared her thoughts, but can you share a few more thoughts in terms of why you prefer ranked choice voting over approval voting?
Well, I think of ranked choice voting as a little bit like a medicine that's in clinical trials. There are a lot of theoretical attributes that it may have, but we don't know how it actually operates in the real world. So the early data gives me great worry about how much people engage with it, as Lisa was saying, that 50 to 90% of voters in any individual race are actually only approving one person. And that's because they recognize that by ranking out anyone else, they're disadvantaging their favorite. And so it could simply be collapsing into essentially the same system that we already have. That's very worrisome. Why would we go through all this trouble in learning a new voting system if it's not going to have the benefits? Second, there's a danger that it actually will end up advantaging candidates favored by the majority demographic in the electorate. So we already have a system in Seattle. We have a system that is quite majoritarian. So subsets of the population have a hard time winning representation in city council. And there's a real danger that in some scenarios, approval voting will end up with the same people. Say, imagine the homeowners of the city, if they're 55 or 60% of the electorate, and they like the same 2 candidates, they might approve them both, and they would choose both of the finalists, leaving with renters with not a single person in the general election. Just as one example of how the electorate could split. That actually could create, in some cases, if it is a racially disparate pattern, it could end up with a Washington state voting rights case, which could land us in court. It could also disadvantage the people who have been trying to get better represented in city government for years. There's a risk of legal action. Therefore, there are some there's that risk, and there's one other as well. There's actually a provision in state law that says you can't give more than one vote to a candidate in the way that Lisa was describing approval voting does. It's never been tested in court. So there's a bunch of these untested attributes of it that make me think, well, let's wait. Let's let someone else work it out. And when it comes out of clinical trials, we might want to consider it. But we know that ranked choice voting works now. So let's not be the guinea pigs for approval voting.
Maybe just one last question to what you just said. One question that came up was, there's the potential for challenging approval voting under the State Voting Rights Act. Is there the same potential for challenging ranked choice voting under some law?
Ranked choice voting has been tested in federal and state courts all over the United States for decades, and it's passed every test. It is, someone can sue over anything at any time, but ranked choice voting has passed the legal test. And approval voting has never been challenged. We just don't know how courts will interpret it.
Thank you. All right, I'll go back to Councilmember Lewis. I recently read the stranger endorsement for 1B, but very interestingly, they endorsed a no vote in the first question. So just for clarity's sake, my understanding is that we'll have two questions on the ballot. The first is, shall we change the system by which we elect city elected officials? And then the second question is, regardless of how you voted in the first question, which would you prefer, approval voting or ranked choice voting? Approval is 1A, ranked choice voting is 1B. So interestingly, the stranger said, okay, if we had to pick, it would be RCV, but we endorse a no vote on the first question because it's like a weak form, it's weak sauce, that you're only using it in the primary, and that we would prefer, although we are big fans of ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice, we want to see like a deep community-driven process, maybe similar to what Portland has done, as a way to really get more people involved in shaping the rules of the game that affect us all. So, Councilmember Lewis, can you respond to the stranger's endorsement of the no vote in the first question?
Yeah, so my read essentially of that stranger editorial was, we want to wait for the state to give us the ability to do the full IRV in the general election on one ballot rather than have the primary process first. And they acknowledge that requires state law change and that we're preempted from doing that. But then they further indicate that they like ranked choice voting. So make sure that you essentially treat 1B as sort of like a poll in a sense, right? Like sort of a plebiscite on, whether or not the populace likes ranked choice voting to build momentum for that process you were just alluding to. So, I would say that, first of all, no matter what you decide on 1A, everyone should definitely weigh in on 1B and should vote for ranked choice voting for that reason. I think that definitely, like, we should convey our preference if you are a fan of ranked choice voting, even if you don't like this particular iteration, you should vote for ranked choice voting in 1B. But then the other thing that I would just say is when it comes to building momentum for this, I do think giving Seattle voters an ability to use ranked choice voting, even in a trial setting in a primary, is going to be helpful to getting people acclimated and into the concept of ranked choice voting and give them some experience using it. So I think that would honestly be part of the organizing process, is passing ranked choice voting, even if it is imperfect, to be using it only in the primary, as part of that transition to the full-on instant runoff voting that is used in other jurisdictions. And that would be my response. So I think you should vote yes on 1A, and then you should vote for ranked choice voting. But look, if there's community members out there that aren't convinced, definitely don't do what the Seattle Times recommended and skip the second question. And part of it is like, I wasn't involved in talking to the Seattle Times about that, but look, this proposition could pass, and it's going to matter what people pick on 1B. And, I think the Times, frankly, kind of did a disservice by not doing a bit more of an analysis of parsing between the options for 1B, because I'm worried a lot of people are gonna skip it. So I appreciate the Stranger at least going to that level and having a more thoughtful analysis in their editorial of basically saying, even though they're not convinced, encouraging people to weigh in on 1B. It is important. And Georgia, unfortunately, I need to jump off here, so that'll be my last question. But really appreciate the opportunity to jump in and look forward to continuing this effort both in Olympia and at the ballot here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember. Good evening. I'm going to shoot the next question that I was going to share with both Councilmember Lewis and Councilmember Balducci. So Councilmember Balducci, regarding the Stranger argument about what we need is really deep community engagement, it made me reflect on the recent King County Charter Review process. I did participate, and I'll be honest, I was a little bit underwhelmed at the community participation, and it felt very much like there already was an agenda and it really wasn't open to new ideas. I know a number of people, myself and Lisa, brought up issues like ranked choice voting, which really didn't go anywhere. So my question to you is, do you have any thoughts in terms of how that charter review process could be more robust, that could lead to deep community engagement around issues like even year elections, like ranked choice voting and other reforms? I know that it just seemed like everything was focused on, like, should we have an elected sheriff? Important, but not the only question that one ought to think about.
Right. Well, thank you for participating on our charter review work. And I will say it's a little bit different at King County than is it at the city of Seattle. We don't have the history and the experience of as much public attention, frankly, at our government level because of the about 1/10 of the people in King County are in unincorporated King County and therefore in our direct local government jurisdiction. So most of what we do is regional. And in my experience, it's just harder to get people to understand the importance of regional work. It's one step removed from their daily lives. It puts me in mind of my time on the city council in Bellevue, where people wouldn't come out over measures that would cost $100 million, but put a speed bump on their street and they would show up. So we've got some work to do. I think that we're a little behind in terms of our sophistication and in public outreach. But I will say that I think we've got some signs of really starting to do a better job. Not directly related to charter, but we can learn the lessons from the charter and apply them, I think, to our next charter review. Things like our newest council member, Gurmai Zahalai, has been very, very engaged in and interested in improving public outreach. He represents some of the largest parts of urban unincorporated King County. And so we've done, we're doing a trial of participatory budgeting. And we've never done anything like that before, where we appropriate a certain amount of money, in this case, $10 million, and allow through a process, a community to really self-direct how those investments are done for, within, the bounds of the purposes that we're trying to serve. And so from that effort, you start to see community leaders emerge who have really strong ideas about the next round of investments and more ambitious investments. And so I see we're starting to build deeper ties with the communities that we serve most directly. We should take that to the next level and try to find ways to engage with communities regionally. It's a little harder. Like I say, we're not the most in people's face government. I do think, just to throw in a little plug for tonight's effort, that the idea of getting more people to vote when only 30% or 40% of eligible voters vote for you, they're not thinking about your government. When 60, 70, 80% of voters vote for you, there's going to be more attention paid. And so I think the combination of getting more people involved in electing us and more attention paid to the issues that they care about with regard to who they're voting for in King County, plus our evolving sophistication and interest in engaging with the community, means that we're primed to do more of that when we get around to charter next time. I don't have a proposed program for you all, but I do think that engaging with groups like the folks on this call tonight will be a key part of, and getting started earlier. Start earlier with an idea about actually engaging the community in like how we engage the community, sort of a plan to plan, but let the community help to drive what they want to see us do. Because a lot of the problem is when we show up with a mission and a deadline and we say, okay, we've got 3 months, go, there's not really a lot of time to say, let's open this up more. We didn't have enough engagement. Let's take a step back. Let's open it up more because now we're on the clock. So I think a key part of it will be letting the project have enough time and space and staffing to really do what we need to get better community engagement.
Two thoughts regarding that. I know that, well, I'll just say that I grew up in Skyway, so I'm all about county government. I used to think that Ruby Chow was my mayor because my social studies teacher said, you don't have a mayor. I'm like, Ruby Chow's my mayor. She shows up at our Skyway Day Parade.
You were correct.
So I'm reflecting that the city of Portland has a really robust charter review process such that 20 people are selected. And if 15 of them agree, then whatever they recommend goes directly to the ballot. Whereas the King County charter review process, everything has to go back to the council and the council can just ignore it or do whatever they want with it. So it doesn't feel independent at all. And then thinking about how British Columbia approached big questions about electoral systems reform, they had what's called a citizens assembly or a community assembly, where a random selection of voters, I believe, over 100 people comprised this deliberative body that heard expert testimony and deliberated and came up with a really strong proposal. What do you think about including some of those ideas into the next King County charter review process?
I would certainly be willing to take a look at them and look at other ways that people do this sort of work. I do believe that some of those ideas you're mentioning would themselves require us to change our charter in order to do them. And so part of it would be making sure we understand what we're trying to achieve, a little bit of problem definition, and then tailoring the approach. And then we'd have to give ourselves enough. Luckily, we have time now because there's a little space between now and our next major charter update. That said, can I say that one thing? You can do a singular update to a charter anytime. All you need is for the council to put it on the agenda. That's what this even year elections proposal is. Was somebody came in, a group of constituents with a good idea, convinced a council member to champion it, and here we are. So yes and yes, these are ands, not ors. Yes, we should be thinking more about how we get a better, more robust, public engaged charter review process for our major 10-year updates, but we can also do interim charter updates at any time if you can, get your elected officials to be representative of what you want, which is what it's all about tonight, right?
Exactly. And we look forward to our next conversation after this election about the next charter amendment. I'm going to go, I know that we have maybe about 10 minutes left, 5 to 10 minutes left. So if there are other questions that folks have, please do drop them in the Q&A. I'll try to hit as many as the other remaining questions that I have in my queue. Just please know that I've been directed a lot of the questions. So even though you don't see them live at home, I am getting fed these questions, or I have like ESP divine. I'm divining all of the questions that you've typed in, and I'm just putting it out there. I'm a medium. This is for Kamau. This is regarding turnout. How do you respond to those who say that voting is so easy? Posted, paid ballots, and I'll vote by mail and same day. Like, my gosh, how much more easy can it get? So if it's so easy here, those who don't turn out just don't care enough. So why bother trying to remove all the barriers when, it's just the barriers are so low anyway?
Yeah, that's a good question. The person who asked that question does have a point that there are some people who think, I don't believe in voting. I don't believe in democracy. I'm opting out on purpose. But if you've ever canvassed voters or knocked on doors, you know that that's really a very small minority of voters. Most people, even though it seems easy to those of us who might be on this call and care a lot about politics, most people don't care about politics and think about it very, very little. They think about it much more like hygiene or taking out the trash. Like it's something that you need to do. It's not the end all be all. But it's still important. That's the view of most people. Now, what happens when you ask people about why didn't you vote in the last election? They almost universally respond that they didn't hear about it, that they didn't know that an election was happening. And in addition to my role, I also sit on our state's voter file organization called Win-Win Network that many civic organizations use. And there is a lot of outreach that goes on, but not as much as you would think, and definitely not enough to talk to every single voter. And our system kind of relies on you being someone with stable housing. So, and having a regular address and feeling really comfortable when you get your mail. And for our organization, we started with the census, which is, even a more low barrier thing about just filling out a form, which you can do online to get counted. But a lot of people aren't paying attention to the news. They're blocking it out. They think it's a lot of fighting. And it was, it took people coming together and talking to their neighbors and their family and friends to do that. And the trend you saw was that if you lived in a neighborhood with a big house, the mail you get is really positive. You've had the same address for years. You're just getting postcards from your grandkids who are doing study abroad. You have a really different experience than someone who's moving around a lot, like young people who actually in our state, we see that there's higher voting rates for people who are 18 and voting than in their mid-20s because they're changing addresses all the time. Their lives are in flux. They don't have predictable shifts. And so they might think to themselves, oh yeah, I think there's an election going on. I'm going to put that aside and come back to it on Monday. They go out to dinner and kind of forget about it. And so logistically, we have a really great system for people to have an easy time voting. But in terms of the public conversation about the elections that are happening, we don't have as many resources that are going to talk to every single person. And so what Even Year Elections does is not, there's a significant amount that is like the logistics, but what the effect that it has on the ecosystem and the public conversation is that it takes this form of government, county level, stuck between, the cities and the federal government and the state government, and moves it to be inside of a much larger conversation so that people have an easier way. So it's much easier for people to learn that an election is going on, that it is important to vote. And then once they get their ballot, the evidence shows that most people fill out their ballot entirely to the best of their ability. So it's a great question. It's not so much that people have a logistical hard time voting. It's that they're not aware that an election is happening at all and aren't able to engage in the glide path that is our mail-in voting system with prepaid postage. Lisa might have something to add.
Yeah, just one thing to add. Thanks, Kamau. Great answer. Speculating, understanding, learning why people aren't voting and moving the elections to when more people are already voting just makes so much sense. But also consider that many voters report that they aren't excited about the two candidates that are on our ballot here in Washington State. We have a top two system. And as Alan Durning described, we're often weeding out some of the more interesting candidates in that primary. So voters show up in November, they look at two candidates, neither one of them represents their values. It's not an awful lot of choices. And that doesn't give voters a lot of encouragement to vote. Plus the fact that only being able to pick one candidate when you vote is a really limited way of adding your voice to the public conversation. So one of the things we know from polling in places that are using ranked choice voting is that voters feel that their vote really matters more, and therefore participating is just it matters, and they know that. And so we are seeing we don't have any data to prove that ranked choice voting drives higher voter turnout, but it is associated with higher voter turnout. We're seeing some of the largest turnout ever in places that are using ranked choice voting, like New York City and Alaska. And we need more study to understand the relationship between turnout, but it really looks anecdotally as though voters are recognizing that ranked choice gives them a reason to vote.
Last question to Lisa in 1 minute or less. Who's financially supporting approval voting, and who's supporting ranked choice voting financially?
Well, we're really fortunate here in Washington. We have great public transparency laws. So anybody can look at the Public Disclosure Commission, PDC websites and see those reported donors. And on the approval voting side, as I mentioned, it does not have local or even Washington state support. It's there's a small amount, but it's predominantly an out-of-state effort, mostly funded from one organization in California called the Center for Election Science, and one wealthy individual who's I think resides in Florida and the Bahamas. And on the ranked choice side, we do have a lot of local support. We also have some national donors who are supporting the ranked choice movement, who have supported it in states around the country. Alan, I know you've done a fair amount of research on this. Anything you want to add?
If folks are curious, as Lisa said, we have the Public Disclosure Commission and the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission. If you're interested in learning more about who is supporting any of these ballot questions for November. All right, we are nearing the end of our time tonight. I know, and I hope, and I know that you have found this forum interesting and instructive. I've had a good time, and I'm going to have some wine afterwards. So I had a good time without any wine. So that's amazing. I want to thank the panelists and the sponsors and everyone who's worked behind the scenes to make this all happen. And thank you for including me in this program. I'm now going to turn this over to the League of Women Voters, Seattle-King County's first Vice President, Mary Taylor. Mary.
Hi, I just want to reiterate what you just said, George. Thanking everyone who has our panelists, our moderator, all the behind the scenes production staff, and the organizations who sponsored, and everyone who attended. We hope that you leave here with a better understanding of democracy reform at the local level. We also hope that you are moved to action. You can make a difference by giving of your time and talents, volunteer in the community, reach out to any of the sponsor organizations, become a League of Women Voters member. And I also want to remind you that the League is a nonprofit grassroots organization. Volunteers and contributions from the community allow us to continue our work and put forth events like tonight's. So I encourage all of you to please take a moment, visit our website, and consider a contribution or joining the League or volunteering. Lastly, everyone should expect an email with the links to the resources that were put in the chat and a link to the YouTube video of tonight's presentation, which will also be available on the League's YouTube site. So thanks everyone, and good night.